Imagine you're born into a country sitting on billions of dollars worth of oil, gold, or fertile land. Your nation has more natural resources than most of Europe combined. But your children are starving. Your hospitals have no medicine. Your government owes more money than it will ever be able to repay. And somehow, every decade, it gets worse. This isn't a story about laziness. It isn't a story about corruption alone. And it definitely isn't about bad luck. This is a story about a system. A system designed, with great precision, to make sure that wealth flows in one direction. And that direction is never toward you. Today, we're asking the question that development economists whisper but rarely say out loud. What if poor countries aren't failing? What if they're being failed on purpose? In 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo gained independence from Belgium. It had more mineral wealth per square mile than almost any nation on Earth. Cobalt, copper, coltan, the mineral inside every smartphone you've ever owned. Within 2 years, its democratically elected leader, Patrice Lumumba, was dead. Assassinated, with direct involvement from the CIA and Belgian intelligence. The man who replaced him, Mobutu Sese Seko, ruled for 32 years. He looted an estimated $5 billion from the country. He was supported, armed, and legitimized by the West the entire time. The Congo today ranks among the poorest nations on Earth. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And the Congo is just one example. The same story, different names, different resources, different decade, plays out across Latin America, Southeast Asia, West Africa, and the Middle East. So, how exactly does it work? The system has 3 main tools. Think of them as 3 locked doors, each one designed to keep wealth out of reach. Door number 1, debt. When a poor country needs money, for roads, for hospitals, for infrastructure, it borrows, usually from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The loans come with conditions. They're called Structural Adjustment Programs, or SAPs, and they sound reasonable on paper. Cut government spending, privatize state industries, open your markets to foreign competition, devalue your currency. But what actually happens? The government cuts education and healthcare first, because those are the biggest budget lines. Foreign corporations buy up water systems, mines, and utilities at bargain prices. Local industries collapse because they can't compete with subsidized Western imports. And the currency devaluation makes the debt, which is priced in dollars, immediately larger in local terms. The country is now poorer than when it borrowed the money, so it borrows more. It's not a ladder out of poverty, it's a treadmill. Door number 2, trade rules. Here's a paradox that should make you angry. Rich countries preach free trade to poor countries while quietly protecting their own industries. The United States spends over $20 billion a year subsidizing its domestic agriculture. The European Union does the same. This makes American and European food artificially cheap on global markets. A Ghanaian rice farmer cannot compete with subsidized American rice being dumped into his local market at prices below his cost of production. So he goes out of business. His family moves to the city. The city becomes overcrowded. The government loses tax revenue. Poverty deepens. And at every WTO negotiation, rich countries block the same agricultural subsidies for poor nations that they themselves rely on. The rules of the game are written by the people who are already winning. Door number 3. Capital flight and tax havens. Even when poor countries do generate wealth, it rarely stays. Multinational corporations extract resources, oil, minerals, timber, and report their profits in tax havens like Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, or the British Virgin Islands. The Global Financial Integrity Organization estimates that for every $1 in foreign aid that flows into Africa, approximately $10 flows out through illicit capital flight, tax avoidance, and debt repayment. Read that again. $10 out for every $1 in. Foreign aid isn't charity. In the context of the full financial picture, it's a rounding error, a public relations exercise. The 3 doors work together. Debt forces dependency. Trade rules prevent self-sufficiency. And capital flight ensures that any wealth created disappears offshore before it can build anything lasting. Let's put a human face on this. In 1983, Tanzania was a relatively stable African nation. Julius Nyerere, its founding president, had invested heavily in education. Tanzania had one of the highest literacy rates on the continent. Then the IMF arrived. Tanzania needed debt relief. The IMF agreed, with conditions. Cut the civil service, introduce school fees, charge for hospital visits. Almost overnight, school enrollment collapsed. Child mortality rose. The public health system, which had been one of Africa's most functional, began to disintegrate. Nyerere, near the end of his life, asked a question that has never been adequately answered. Should I starve my children to pay my debts? He never got a satisfying answer. Neither did Tanzania. Across the continent, Ghana, Zambia, Nigeria, nearly identical programs produced nearly identical results. Short-term debt stabilization, followed by long-term social collapse. Meanwhile, the economists who designed these programs were winning Nobel Prizes. Now, let's move closer to the present. In 2001, Argentina defaulted on its debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that time. Years of IMF-guided austerity had hollowed out its economy. Unemployment hit 25%. The middle class evaporated in a matter of months. People banged pots outside banks that had frozen their savings. The IMF's response? It withheld further loans to force more austerity. When Argentina eventually broke from the IMF playbook, defaulting, devaluing, and stimulating domestically, its economy grew by over 8% annually for the next several years. The medicine was the disease. And in Greece, a decade later, the same script played out inside the European Union itself. A debt crisis met with brutal austerity. GDP fell by 25%. Youth unemployment hit 60%. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. All to protect the balance sheets of German and French banks, who had recklessly overlent in the first place. The pattern is no longer just a developing world story. The architecture is expanding. Global debt in developing nations has reached record levels. The World Bank estimates that over 60% of low-income countries are now in debt distress or at high risk of it. China has entered this space aggressively, offering infrastructure loans with fewer social conditions, but often with strategic asset clauses. If you can't repay, China gets the port. or the mine, or the railway. It's a new lender. The same architecture. Meanwhile, climate change is compounding everything. The countries contributing least to global carbon emissions are absorbing the most catastrophic effects: drought, flooding, crop failure. They need to borrow to survive climate disasters they didn't cause, and the debt deepens. There is also a brain drain that never makes the headlines. When countries are stripped of public investment, their most educated citizens leave. Doctors trained in Nigeria practice in London. Engineers from Ghana build infrastructure in Canada. The countries that extracted the wealth also extract the talent, funded by the education systems of the very nations being drained. The system is self-reinforcing at every level. Here's the uncomfortable truth. None of this requires a conspiracy meeting in a dark room. No shadowy council deciding which countries to destroy. It just requires a system that rewards short-term extraction over long-term development. Institutions governed by voting shares weighted toward the countries with the most money. Trade rules negotiated by the countries with the most lawyers. And a global financial architecture built in 1944 at Bretton Woods by the people who were already powerful. The system doesn't need to be evil to produce evil outcomes. It just needs to be left alone. Some countries have broken the pattern. Botswana negotiated genuine equity stakes in its diamond industry. South Korea protected its infant industries from foreign competition until they were strong enough to compete. China, whatever your view of its politics, industrialized 800 million people out of poverty by ignoring IMF advice entirely. The path out exists, but it requires something that the current system is specifically designed to prevent: the freedom to choose your own economic path. And until the architecture changes, the debt structures, the trade rules, the tax havens, the voting weights at the IMF, the treadmill keeps running. The wealth keeps flowing in one direction. And the children born into resource-rich, cash-poor nations will keep asking the same question Nyerere asked in 1983, without getting an answer. The IMF has issued over 700 loan agreements since 1980. Can you name a single country that became prosperous because of one? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you can't, maybe that tells us everything.